The frost hadn't even left the headstone when my own daughter told me I had until sunset to get out of the house my wife and I had built with our own 2 hands. I remember standing at the edge of my wife's grave in that quiet cemetery just outside Kingston, Ontario, watching the funeral director fold up the last of the green canvas chairs. Eleanor had been buried that morning under a sky the color of wet slate, the kind of February sky that makes you feel like the whole province is holding its breath. 41 years of marriage. 41 years of her humming old Gordon Lightfoot songs while she did the dishes, of her leaving little notes in my lunchbox when I still worked at the mill in Trenton, of her squeezing my hand during every thunderstorm because she'd been afraid of them since she was a girl. And now she was gone, lowered into the cold Canadian earth beside her mother, and I was 67 years old, and I didn't know how I was supposed to keep breathing. My name is Walter Harrington, and before that morning I would have told you I was the luckiest man in Frontenac County. I had my Eleanor. I had our daughter, Claire. I had the old farmhouse on the edge of Sydenham that we'd bought back in 1984 when the interest rates were high enough to make a grown man cry, but we scraped and saved and paid it off before I turned 55. I had my little workshop out back where I built birdhouses and shelves and, once, a cradle for Claire's first child. I thought I had everything a man could want. I was wrong about one of those things. Claire had flown in from Calgary 3 days before the funeral, and right from the moment she walked through the door with her husband, Derek, something felt off. She hugged me the way you hug a distant uncle at a wedding. Derek, who worked in commercial real estate development out west, kept taking phone calls in the driveway and glancing around the living room like he was sizing up a listing. I chalked it up to grief. Grief makes people strange, I told myself. Eleanor used to say that everybody mourns in their own language. The morning of the funeral, Claire insisted on driving me to the church in her rental car. She barely spoke on the way there. When the service was over and the neighbors had finished bringing their casseroles and their condolences, when the last of the mourners had filed out of our living room with their coats and their hushed goodbyes, Claire sat me down at the kitchen table. Derek stood behind her with his arms crossed, and I remember thinking that he looked less like a son-in-law and more like a bailiff. "Dad," she said, and her voice was the voice of a stranger. "We need to talk about the house." I didn't understand her at first. I thought maybe she was worried about me rattling around in all those rooms by myself, and I was ready to tell her I'd be fine, that Eleanor's ghost would keep me company, that I still had the dog and my workshop and my neighbor Hank across the road. But then Derek pulled a folder out of his briefcase and slid it across the table, and my whole life tipped sideways. "They had power of attorney," Claire said. Eleanor had signed it over to her 2 years ago, back when the cancer diagnosis first came, and she was worried about what would happen if she couldn't make decisions for herself. Claire had used that power of attorney, along with some paperwork I didn't remember signing, to put the deed of the house in her name. She told me it had been for tax reasons. She told me it had been to protect the property from some vague scenario she couldn't quite articulate. And now, she said, Derek had a business opportunity in Calgary, and they needed to liquidate. I needed to be out by the end of the day. I looked at my daughter, the little girl who used to climb into my lap during Saturday morning cartoons, the teenager I'd taught to drive in the church parking lot, the young woman I'd walked down the aisle just 12 years ago, and I didn't recognize her. Her eyes were flat. Her mouth was set. She wouldn't look at me directly. Derek kept checking his watch. I asked her how she could do this on the day I buried her mother. She said the timing was unfortunate, but the decision had been made months ago. Months. Before Eleanor had even passed. My son-in-law told me they'd already arranged a room for me at a motel off Highway 38 for the night, and after that, there were seniors' residences I could look into. He said it like he was doing me a favor. He said the word seniors, the way some people say kennel. I don't remember packing. I remember my hands shaking as I tried to fold Eleanor's blue sweater, the one she'd worn the last time we sat on the porch together. I remember picking up our wedding photo from the mantel and then putting it back because I couldn't decide if it belonged to me or to the house. I remember standing in the doorway of our bedroom and feeling like I was abandoning her all over again. When I carried my last duffel bag out to my old Ford pickup, the February wind cut straight through my good wool coat. Claire stood on the porch with her arms wrapped around herself. I thought, for a moment, she might break. I thought she might run down the steps and tell me it had all been some terrible misunderstanding. Instead, she told me that the locksmith was coming in an hour, and that she'd already forwarded my mail to a post office box in Kingston. Then, she went inside and closed the door. I drove down that long gravel lane for the last time with tears freezing on my face. That first night, I didn't go to the motel. I couldn't stomach the thought of a stranger's bedsheets. Instead, I drove to the Tim Hortons off Highway 15 and sat in the parking lot for 4 hours, nursing a double-double that went cold in my hand, watching the snow drift across the empty lot under the sodium lights. Eleanor's ashes weren't with me. I had wanted her buried, and she had wanted to be buried, so she was resting in the plot we had bought together back in 2019, right beside her mother and the empty space that was supposed to be mine someday. But I kept thinking about what I hadn't taken. Her reading glasses on the nightstand, the quilt her grandmother had made, the cedar chest at the foot of our bed that I'd never once looked inside because Eleanor had told me, laughing, that it was her private business and I was never to snoop. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, I remembered something. 3 months before she died, Eleanor had asked me for a favor. She'd been weak by then, the chemotherapy hollowing her out, but her mind had been sharp as ever. She'd asked me to drive her to a little storage facility in Napanee, a place called Loyalist Self-Storage, and to wait in the truck while she went inside with a small cardboard box. She'd been gone for almost an hour. When she came back out, she'd been empty-handed, and she'd pressed a small brass key into my palm. "Walter," she had said, and her voice had been so quiet, I'd had to lean in close. "If anything ever goes wrong after I'm gone, anything at all, you take this key and you go to Unit 147. Promise me." I had promised. And then I had put the key in the little wooden box on my dresser and forgotten all about it, the way you forget about things you hope you'll never need. That wooden box was in the duffel bag beside me. I fumbled through my things in the dark of the truck cab, my fingers stiff from the cold, and I found the key right where I'd left it. Small, brass, tarnished at the edges, attached to a little paper tag with the number 147 written in Eleanor's familiar handwriting. I held it in my palm and I thought about my wife, sick and tired and dying, making that long drive to that storage unit, carrying whatever she'd carried inside, and I realized something. Eleanor had known. Somehow, before the end, she had known that something was coming, and she had tried to prepare me. The storage facility didn't open until 8 in the morning, so I slept in the cab of my truck in the Tim Hortons parking lot with my coat pulled up over my chest. When the sun finally came up gray and weak over the frozen farmland, I drove the 40 minutes to Napanee with my stomach in knots. Unit 147 was a small one, tucked at the end of a long row of corrugated metal doors. The padlock was frozen shut, and I had to hold the key in my hand for a full minute to warm it up before it would turn. When the door finally rolled up with that familiar rattle, my breath caught in my chest. The unit was almost empty. There was a single metal filing cabinet pushed against the back wall, a folding chair, and on top of the cabinet, a laptop computer, brand new by the look of it, sitting on a small manila envelope with my name written across the front in Eleanor's handwriting. My knees gave out a little, and I had to steady myself against the doorframe. I stepped inside, and the cold concrete floor crunched under my boots. I opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a letter, handwritten, 3 pages long. "My darling Walter," it began, and I had to stop and wipe my eyes because I hadn't expected to hear her voice again. Eleanor's letter told me everything. She wrote that she had suspected Derek for a long time, almost from the moment Claire had first brought him home to meet us at that Thanksgiving dinner in 2014. Something about the way he'd looked at our house, she said. The way he'd asked too many questions about the property lines and the mortgage, and whether the farmhouse had been appraised recently. She had kept her suspicions to herself because she hadn't wanted to drive a wedge between us and our daughter. But then, she wrote, things had started happening. Small things at first. Documents she didn't remember signing. Bank statements that didn't quite add up. A call from a solicitor in Calgary asking about powers of attorney. She wrote that she had gone to see her own lawyer in Kingston, a woman named Margaret Lebeau, who had been a friend of hers since their days at Queen's University back in the 60s, and the two of them had quietly started putting things together. Eleanor had hired a private investigator. She had made copies of every document that passed through the house. And she had recorded things, Walter. She had recorded so many things. The laptop, she wrote, contained 38 video files and 9 audio recordings. 47 pieces of evidence in total. The password was the name of our first dog, followed by the year we got married. She had also, she wrote, updated her will in the autumn of 2024 without telling Claire. The old will that Claire had been counting on, the one that left the house to our daughter upon my death, had been superseded by a new one filed with Margaret LeBeau's office. Everything now passed to me, and after me, to a trust Eleanor had set up. But the most important thing, Eleanor wrote, the thing she needed me to know before I watched anything else, was that her cancer had been real. But the speed of it, the suddenness of the final decline, the way she had gone from stable to gone in less than 6 weeks, had not been natural. She was certain of this. She had asked Margaret to arrange for a forensic pathologist to be on standby. And she had asked, in her updated will, for an autopsy to be performed before her burial. The results, she wrote, would arrive at Margaret's office within 2 weeks of her death. I sat down on that folding chair in that cold storage unit and I cried like a child. I cried for Eleanor, who had spent her last months afraid and alone in a way she'd never told me about. I cried for myself, for being too trusting, too blind, for not seeing what my own wife had seen. And I cried because somewhere inside me, underneath all the grief, a small and terrible fire had started to burn. I drove straight from that storage unit to Margaret LeBeau's office in downtown Kingston. She was expecting me. Eleanor had told her I would come. Margaret was a small woman in her late 60s with silver hair cut short and sharp, and she greeted me with the kind of warmth that told me she and Eleanor had been closer friends than I'd ever realized. She sat me down in her office with a cup of strong coffee and she walked me through everything. The autopsy results had come in the day before. Eleanor had been right. The pathologist had found traces of a compound in her system that should not have been there, a medication used primarily in hospice care for pain management, but at levels far beyond what her palliative care doctor had prescribed. Someone had been giving her additional doses. Someone had been accelerating her death. Margaret asked me if I was prepared to go to the police. I told her I needed to watch the videos first. I needed to know what my wife had known before I took another step. I spent the next 4 days in a small, furnished apartment above a bookstore in downtown Kingston that Margaret had arranged for me. I sat at a borrowed kitchen table and I watched every single one of those 47 recordings. I watched Eleanor setting up a small hidden camera in the kitchen of our farmhouse, explaining to the lens what she was doing and why. I watched Claire and Derek sitting at our own dining room table while we were out at a doctor's appointment, going through our filing cabinet, photographing documents. Derek coaching Claire on what to say to me and when to say it. I watched Derek on the phone with someone, talking about property values and timelines, and the difficulty of getting a stubborn old man to sign things. And then I watched the recording that broke me. It had been taken in our own living room, 6 weeks before Eleanor died. I had been out that morning at the hardware store in Kingston, picking up a new snowblower belt. Eleanor had been asleep upstairs. Claire had told Derek she was, and they had sat on our couch, and they had talked about how much longer she could possibly last. Derek had asked Claire if the new dosage was working. Claire had said she thought so, that her mother had seemed weaker the last 2 nights. Derek had told her to be patient, that it wouldn't be long now, that once Eleanor was gone, the rest would be simple. My own daughter, my own child. I had to stop the video 3 times because my chest hurt so badly I thought I was having a heart attack. But I kept watching. I watched all 47. There were the audio recordings Eleanor had made of Claire on phone calls, talking to Derek about the inheritance, about the timing, about how the old man, meaning me, would probably be easy to push out once she was gone. There were the photographs of bank transfers Derek had made from a joint account he'd somehow gotten Eleanor's name onto through forged signatures. There was the video Eleanor had recorded of herself, alone in our bedroom 3 weeks before she died, looking straight into the camera with her thin hands folded in her lap, telling me that she loved me, that she had always loved me, that she was sorry she hadn't been able to tell me any of this while she was still alive. But she hadn't wanted me to have to carry the knowledge of our daughter's betrayal during her final weeks. She had wanted me to have a peaceful goodbye. She had wanted to spare me that, at least. She had called it her silent revenge, her way of making sure that even after she was gone, the truth would come out. I went to the police with Margaret LeBeau at my side. The investigation took months. The Ontario Provincial Police opened a formal case, and because the autopsy evidence was strong and the recordings were comprehensive, the Crown prosecutor took it seriously from the beginning. Derek was arrested at the Calgary airport trying to board a flight to Mexico 11 days after the charges were filed. Claire was arrested at her home in the southwest of the city 2 hours later. The trial took place the following autumn in the courthouse on Court Street in Kingston. I sat in that courtroom every single day. I heard the forensic pathologist testify. I heard the private investigator Eleanor had hired explain how she had documented the financial irregularities. I heard the recordings played aloud in open court, heard my daughter's voice filling that wood-paneled room, heard her discussing her own mother's death with the casualness of someone ordering lunch. Derek was convicted on charges of first-degree murder, fraud over $5,000, forgery, and conspiracy. He was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years. Claire was convicted of second-degree murder and fraud. She received a sentence of life with no parole eligibility for 16 years. When the verdicts were read, I did not feel triumph. I did not feel victory. I felt the same hollow grief I had felt standing at Eleanor's grave, only deeper now, because I had lost two people, not one. I had lost my wife, and I had lost the daughter I thought I'd raised. Although I was beginning to understand that the daughter I thought I'd raised had perhaps never really existed. I went home to the farmhouse in Sydenham after the trial. The deed had been returned to my name as part of the settlement. I walked through every room slowly, touching the door frames, the window sills, the banister Eleanor had painted white the summer before the diagnosis. Her blue sweater was still folded in the closet where I'd left it. Her reading glasses were still on the nightstand, and the cedar chest at the foot of our bed, the one she'd told me never to open, I opened it at last. Inside were letters. Hundreds of letters. Every card I'd ever given her, every note, every scribbled grocery list I'd left on the fridge over 41 years of marriage. She had kept all of them. At the bottom of the chest, wrapped in tissue paper, was the little wooden cradle I'd built for Claire before she was born. I sat on the floor of our bedroom, and I held that cradle for a long time. In the year that followed, I did two things. First, I sold the farmhouse. I couldn't live there anymore. Every room held too much of Eleanor, and too much of the daughter I had lost. I bought a small bungalow in Wolf Island, just across the ferry from Kingston, with a view of the St. Lawrence River. My neighbor from the old place, Hank, helped me move. He didn't ask a lot of questions. He just showed up with his truck and a case of Molson Canadian and a willingness to help an old friend start over. The second thing I did was establish the Eleanor Harrington Foundation, funded by the insurance payout, the proceeds from the house sale, and the assets that had been returned to me after the fraud convictions. The foundation provides legal support and advocacy for elderly Canadians who suspect they are being financially or medically abused by family members. Margaret Lebeau sits on the board. So does a retired Crown attorney from Ottawa. So does a palliative care nurse from Toronto who lost her own mother to similar circumstances. In its first year alone, the foundation helped 17 families in Ontario, Quebec, and the Maritimes identify and document elder abuse. 6 of those cases are now active criminal investigations. Eleanor's silent revenge, I realized, didn't end with Claire and Derek. It became something larger. It became a way for other people's grandmothers and grandfathers to be protected from the kind of slow, quiet violence that had taken my wife from me. I am 71 years old now. I live alone on Wolf Island with a rescue dog named Gordy. I visit Eleanor's grave on the first Saturday of every month, regardless of the weather, and I bring her a single yellow rose, because yellow was the color of the dress she wore the day I met her, at a barn dance in Odessa in 1962. I do not visit my daughter in prison, and I do not expect that I ever will. Some nights, when the wind is coming off the river and the lights of Kingston are glittering across the water, I sit on my porch and I talk to Eleanor out loud. I tell her about my day. I tell her about the dog. I tell her about the families the foundation has helped that month. And I tell her, always, that she was the bravest person I have ever known. That while I was sleeping through our daughter's betrayal, she was awake and watching and gathering and loving me enough to make sure that the truth would survive her. If you are listening to this story and you are a son or a daughter, please go and call your parents tonight. Tell them you love them. Mean it. And if you are old, like me, and you have started to notice that something feels wrong in your own home, that the people around you are asking questions they shouldn't be asking, that documents are appearing and disappearing, please do not dismiss the feeling. Write things down, keep copies, talk to a lawyer you can trust, because the ones who love you will never mind that you took precautions, and the ones who do mind, well, those are the ones you needed the precautions for in the first place. Eleanor knew that. Eleanor, God rest her beautiful soul, knew that all along.